Any fan of physics knows that quantum mechanics is all screwed up. We have numbers, but no insight to match those numbers. Measurement problem, double-slit madness, and the works. So I spent the last 3 years trying to solve it. If I'm right, then by the end of this video, you'll know why the wave function collapses. Let's get this show on the road. We got timelines all wrong. Instead of living on one single timeline, you do the opposite. You live on multiple timelines at once. As in right now, your consciousness is sitting on multiple timelines. This is actually the natural state of consciousness. Not that crazy version where you have an entire deterministic timeline unfolded with all its information already coded into it. Let me give you an example. What's your great-grandfather's name? Not sure? Well then, imagine a list of every possible name he could have had, and then drop each one on a timeline, giving him a whole life of being called that name. Guess what? You're on every single one of those timelines because of the fact that you don't know. So as long as something on a timeline can't contradict your knowledge, then you're on every such timeline at once, which sits right outside your knowledge of the universe. This means that everything in the universe operates like Schrodinger's cat, where it's in all states at once so long as it doesn't raise a contradiction to your knowns. And the cat itself isn't in quantum superposition because of the particle. Instead, both the particle and the cat are in superposition strictly because you don't know how they'll turn out. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? More like if no one is around to hear it, then it fell and didn't fall at once. So the line between the quantum realm and the classical realm blurs entirely. We solve the difference by noting that there is no inherent difference. You might as well be quantum yourself. Note how reality is empirically indistinguishable in this weird quantum world I'm talking about versus the deterministic one we're all used to. So as far as you know, either could be right. The same human at two different times is actually two different quantum observers. That is, don't fall into the anthropocentric trap of calling one person one observer across all times. This is why the superposition collapses. It's not that the object or particle changed at all. Instead, your own reality did, as you either joined a timeline to greater specificity or gained information in general. So instead of reality changing, you simply moved to a new one. This now highlights a massive error in the way quantum physics is done, which is to suppose that the observer is locked to their timeline while the wave function collapses. The real answer, though, is very different. Take Schrodinger's cat, for example. Suppose you are the experimenter in our thought experiment, and you haven't checked the box yet. Here's the big idea. Relative to your current quantum observer status, the cat will be in superposition forever, until the end of time. And even after you check, at which point your future self will also be in superposition and making both reactions at once, again, all relative to your current observer status, that is. But once you check, and for example see an alive cat hopefully, then relative to your new observer status, it was always this way, and was never in superposition in the first place. Why? Because now it's in your knowns, and so as such, was always the way it is relative to your new reality. So like I said, the cat didn't change at all, the particle didn't change at all, the superposition didn't change at all, only your reality did. You went from one where it was in superposition forever to never being in superposition in the first place. At this point, we realize that your own possession of information is your fundamental connection to reality, the very symbol and representation of your presence there, so to speak. In essence, we create an inseparable tie between your knowns and your reality. Reality exists only relative to your knowns, and your knowns only exist relative to your reality. Reality comes in pairs, if you will. The reality itself and your subjective presence in it through what you do and do not know. We should set up a name for the entity representing your knowns and the reality that couples to it. I call it the ethos. The ethos is a mathematical object that has slots built into it, which I call attributes. For each slot, you can fill it with a corresponding concept, which I call a state. For example, your home country is an attribute, and Sweden is a state, pretty much like an instantiation in computer science. So your ethos is filled with innumerable attributes, for which each one is either occupied by a state or not. If an attribute doesn't have a state with it, then we declare that attribute is outside the ethos. And for any attribute like this, instead of declaring that it is blank, instead we do the opposite and suppose that it holds every possible corresponding state at once. That's where you get your superpositions. But of course, every time you learn something, you fill in a new attribute in your ethos, and in effect, you jump to a whole new ethos. Get it? So when the wave function collapses, that's simply because you've jumped to a new ethos, and now live in whatever new reality is attached to it. Here's the first major postulate of the ethos. Anything may only be real relative to an ethos. If an attribute exists outside an ethos, we note that it is statistically independent to it. If this wasn't the case, then we could write up some logic to learn about it, which would contradict the whole outside thing. Note that the ethos operates in a highly recursive way, such that each attribute in the ethos can be treated as its own entire ethos. That is, an attribute and an ethos are indistinguishable. As such, if we consider the attribute consisting of two other Boolean attributes, then that encompassing attribute takes on a tuple Boolean state rather than a single Boolean, which would have cut out half the information. Note how this is precisely the formula by which ethi combine anyways, and so an attribute in an ethos is just an ethos itself. Also notice how any attribute can be subdivided into two parts only, such that one of the parts is contained within some ethos and the other is statistically independent to it. Technically, we could split our attribute in question into innumerable pieces, but the idea is that you can always combine two attributes into a bigger one, since attributes are just ethi, and so once we split the attribute up, we can just accumulate it into two parts with one inside and one outside the ethos. And yes, one of these can just be a null attribute, so if the outside component is null, then our attribute is in the ethos, where if the inside component is null, then our attribute is outside the ethos. If neither are null, which is statistically what happens in most cases, then we can simply consider that attribute to be a concatenation of sorts between the two, with the exterior component existing in superposition relative to that ethos, but the interior component being rigidly static. Now we should probably update my first point and actually abandon timelines altogether as our medium for understanding reality. This is because the causal chain and causality in general appear to be misguided. Sure, logical implications are still a thing, but it's fallacious to apply that to real-world phenomena. An apple seed doesn't cause an apple tree to grow. I know obviously the seed makes a difference, but what we call causality is only an approximation. Don't confuse it for absolute fact, because if you do, you run the risk of extrapolating it out and getting the whole causal chain. Simply put, initial conditions are not the whole story for writing reality. When we consider how in chaos theory, tweaking initial conditions slightly yields a huge effect later on, we're missing out on how even supposing that there's a direct time causality between the start and finish of the system is arbitrary. Instead of this, use an ethos. Also, another huge point here is that if we do use timelines instead of the ethos, the entire phenomenon of quantum coherence becomes incompatible with our system. But this itself is only a shadow of a bigger issue, which is that the fundamental recursive nature of the ethos is a necessity to describe superpositions accurately. Timelines only allow for one layer of recursion, and as such, force you to miss most of the picture. Let's define two concepts now. A parent ethos and a child ethos. A child ethos is what happens when you add more attributes to an ethos, and a parent ethos is the opposite, when you remove them. Here's another concept to define, an invalid ethos, which is simply an ethos which breaks the fundamental rules of the ethos in some way. Invalid ethi can be described, but are physically impossible to exist in real life. This next one holds a few more iterations of complexity than the major ethos postulates, so I'll call it as a separate outlier from the framework, which still weirdly always applies, but the idea here is what I call the nexus principle. The idea is that at any given moment, you, a biological holder of an ethos, may only possess ethi which are child ethi of any and all of your past ethi. It's a convention more than anything, but assuming it to be true is key to one's interpretation of the universe. Okay, here's another important part that follows directly from the nexus principle. Time becomes two concepts now. Dimensional time, which is the one we know and love, but then also ethic time, which is just a measure of how far along your ethi during life you are. It's weird actually, but we have to make this distinction to avoid a contradiction when we define what now is. You may consider what your point in space-time is at any given moment, but as you'll notice, this point changes with time and movement. By the nexus principle, we pull all previous attributes from all previous ethi when generating new ones, so we would get a contradiction if we kept our previous definition of now in spacetime, and clash this with our current updated point of now. To fix this, simply define ethic time, which is a glorified referential coordinate for each spacetime now. In the same way as we distinguish between your displacement in space at different times with a time coordinate, now we distinguish between spacetime coordinates with a referential ethic time. Okay, so we've exhausted the use of the nexus principle for this video. Now let's move back to the basics. Let's formally describe now what we said earlier with the ethos as a postulate. If an attribute exists outside an ethos, or in other words, if it possesses no state within that ethos, then we can declare that it is in superposition relative to that ethos. Specifically, if an ethos is valid, then any given attribute will be in superposition relative to it if and only if it is statistically independent to it. This is my second major postulate of the ethos. Okay, we're just about to get into the real weeds here, so the logic is going to get harder, but still just as fundamental. Notice how there's one big piece missing in the ethos framework right now, which is that we need a way to differentiate between various flavors, so to speak, of superposition. But as we move on, at this point, language starts to break down for describing quantum states accurately, since, well, nobody's visited this before, it seems. You can still visualize things here, but you need to lean into permutation reasoning, and you'll note here that alternate states might hold the same linguistic statement. Logic is still fully competent here, though, so don't worry about that part. It's really important now to declare the ethic concept of a contradiction. Notice how things can contradict each other outside the ethos, just as a natural consequence of superposition, but things decidedly can't contradict one another while inside the ethos. Specifically, you can't have an ethos for which an attribute is repeated twice within, once with one state and another time with an alternate state. You might note that an attribute with two states in an ethos is just in superposition, but that's not quite right, because an ethic attribute which is in superposition is registered in the ethos as blank, plus it's registered as outside the ethos anyways. But if you performed an operation on an ethos, for example, where you took two ethi with an attribute of best ice cream, with one holding vanilla and one holding chocolate, and then found a common child ethos of the two, well then that child ethos would hold a contradiction, because it holds two different versions of the attribute with two different states. On the other hand, if both were vanilla, then the child ethos would not be a contradiction, because now it would hold two copies of that attribute with vanilla instead of two contradicting copies. Also, yes, 2 copies versus 1 copy versus 1,000 copies of the same attribute are all the same thing, so long as they have the same state. Kind of like how no matter how many 0 digits you put before a number, it's still the same number. This being the broad definition of a contradiction, we can generalize the idea of a contradiction in general. Okay, so this is inspired kind of by the game chess, where you have checkmate is how you lose the game. Here's the idea. It shouldn't be impossible to make a contradiction impossible. That's it. That's the whole idea. So now we're going to reformulate this in terms of the ethic, words, and then we're going to turn that into a postulate. Here's how we'll do that. Specifically, consider any ethos A. If for all the children of it, each one contains their own child, which contradicts at least one attribute of A, then A is automatically deemed as an invalid ethos. This is a stronger principle than either the ethic contradiction alone or a version where any child of an invalid ethos is also invalid. This implies both, and as I'll postulate, is true. Let's take the contrapositive of that last one now. For any valid ethos A, it contains a child B for which all of its further children cannot contradict the attributes of A. This is my third major postulate of the ethos. And yes, in this case, a child ethos has to not add contradictory attributes outright, which serves as a further specified grade of the child operation. Note how this immediately invalidates an ethos for which somebody performs a double-slit experiment, leaves the detector on, and gets an interference pattern. This is because for every child ethos of the experimenter thereafter, it is possible to contradict the state of the particles going through 2 slits with the realization from the detector that they went through one only. Also, it becomes impossible to invalidate the interference pattern in an ethos where the detector is not running. Thus, this becomes the only valid state. That's another major rule. When it's impossible to invalidate an ethos, it must thus be valid. So, the double-slit experiment's outcome becomes the collection of 4 different ethi, each representing an output. This is where permutations come in. 1. Neither are gone through. 2. Slit A but not slit B is gone through. 3. Slit B but not slit A is gone through. Or 4. Both slits are gone through at once. Anyways, with the detector on, we invalidate case 4 only, leaving the ethos in superposition between 1 and 2 and 3. That is until the spot of the particle on the back screen is checked, thus narrowing the superposition, for instance closer to 2 than 3, or a detector is checked, essentially collapsing it all together, relative to the experimenter's new ethos. With the detector off, it's a bit more subtle. First of all, the result is that we invalidate 2 and 3, leaving the ethos in superposition between 1 and 4. If you refer to the earlier rule, where all states which are statistically independent to your ethos are in superposition relative to it, we might suppose that the slit of traversal is now certainly statistically independent to the observer's ethos, because of course they are unaware of it and cannot access the data by any means, as a consequence of the uncertainty principle. As such, that must be in superposition by that rule. So the fact that it is not in ethi 2 or 3 immediately raises a contradiction in themselves. By corollary of the third major postulate, any child of an ethos which contradicts itself also contradicts it, so neither can be valid. Note the difference from detector on, where we forcefully suggest that 2 and 3 are not statistically independent to the ethos, given that we have already crossed off case 4. Here we cannot do such a thing. So yes, when the detector is on during the double-slit experiment, what happens is that we go from superposition between the particle going through both slits at once to one but not the other in both ways. This specifically is the statement for which language breaks down, because both at once is technically accurate for both versions, but the subtlety is important here. Refer to permutations. If this is right, then now that should encourage us to go on the hunt for more uncertainty principles, which you'll notice will each have their own ripple effects on reality due to the third major postulate. Alright, and that's it so far. What do you think? Did I crack it?